Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, letting these stories carry you into the night. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps me know this community is growing, that we're all connected through these dark tales. And don't forget to like and subscribe, it truly means the world to me. Now let's get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, dim the lights, take a deep breath, relax, and dive into tonight's case. San Diego, California, summer 2011. The kind of summer where the coastal breeze carries the scent of salt and possibility. Where wealthy neighborhoods nestle against cliff sides, where mansions overlook the Pacific, where everything seems touched by golden California light. Coronado, specifically, an affluent island community connected to San Diego by a sweeping bridge, a place where luxury yachts bob in harbors and where the wealthy retreat from the world. The Spreckles Mansion stood at 1043 Boulevard in Coronado, a historic property built in 1908, sprawling across more than 27 rooms. Red-tiled roof, palm trees swaying in manicured gardens, the kind of home that whispered of old money, of legacy, of the American dream realized in stone and mortar. It was beautiful, it was peaceful, and on the morning of July 13, 2011, it became the center of one of the most controversial death investigations in modern American history. A woman's body hung from a second-story balcony, bound hand and foot, a rope around her neck. Her hands were tied behind her back. Her feet were bound together. She hung suspended, lifeless, from the mansion's ornate exterior. The woman's name was Rebecca Zahau. She was 32 years old, and her death would ignite a firestorm of questions that still burn today. Rebecca Maui Zahau was born in Burma, now Myanmar, on March 15, 1979. She came from the Chin ethnic minority, a people who had faced persecution, poverty, and violence in their homeland for generations. The Chin people are predominantly Christian in a majority Buddhist nation, and that difference made them targets. Rebecca's family knew hardship intimately, but Rebecca was a survivor. She was intelligent, driven, and deeply compassionate. In her early 20s, she immigrated to the United States, seeking the opportunities that had been denied to her in Burma. She worked hard. She learned English. She adapted to a culture vastly different from the one she'd known, and she succeeded. Those who knew Rebecca described her as gentle, soft-spoken, kind-hearted. She had a warmth about her, a quiet grace that drew people in. She wasn't loud or demanding. She didn't seek the spotlight, but she had an inner strength, a resilience forged in the fires of her difficult childhood. Rebecca worked as an ophthalmic technician, assisting ophthalmologists with eye examinations and procedures. It was detailed work, requiring precision and patience, qualities Rebecca possessed in abundance. Her co-workers remembered her as conscientious, always willing to help, never complaining. In her personal life, Rebecca was devoted to her family. She sent money back to Burma regularly, supporting relatives who still struggled there. She stayed in close contact with her sister Mary Zahau Lohner, who had also immigrated to the United States and lived in Missouri. The two sisters spoke frequently, sharing their lives across the distance. Rebecca had been in a relationship with Jonah Shacknai for approximately 2 years by the summer of 2011. Jonah was a pharmaceutical executive, the founder and CEO of Medicis Pharmaceutical Corporation, a company specializing in dermatological and aesthetic medicine products. He was wealthy, very wealthy. Forbes estimated his net worth at the time in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Jonah was 54 years old in 2011, more than 2 decades older than Rebecca. He had been married twice before. His first marriage produced 2 children, a son and a daughter. His second marriage, to Dina Romano, produced a son named Max. Max was 6 years old in the summer of 2011. Jonah and Dina had divorced in 2008, but they maintained a co-parenting relationship for Max's sake. Max spent time with both parents. And when Max was with Jonah, Rebecca was often there helping care for the boy. By all accounts, Rebecca was good with Max. Attentive. She wasn't trying to replace his mother. She understood the delicacy of her position. But she cared for the child, and Max seemed comfortable around her. Rebecca's relationship with Jonah was serious. They weren't married, but they lived together part-time. Rebecca maintained her own home in Coronado, a modest townhouse, but she spent considerable time at Jonah's mansion. They traveled together. They attended social events. To those who knew them, they seemed committed. Friends of Rebecca's noted that she seemed happy in the relationship. She spoke of Jonah with affection. She appreciated his generosity, his intelligence, his success. And while some people whispered about the age difference, about the power and balance inherent in their financial disparity, Rebecca herself never expressed doubts. At least not publicly. Rebecca was building a life, a good life. She had escaped poverty and persecution. She had found work, love, stability. She had dreams of the future, perhaps marriage, perhaps children of her own someday. Her life seemed full of promise. She did not deserve what happened to her. The week leading up to Rebecca's death was marked by tension and tragedy. On Monday, July 11, 2011, Rebecca was at the Spreckles mansion with Max. Jonah was out of town on business in Arizona. It was just Rebecca and the 6-year-old boy in that vast, echoing house. The details of what happened that morning remain disputed, contested, analyzed from every conceivable angle. But the undisputed fact is this: Max Shacknai sustained a catastrophic injury. He fell. The official investigation concluded that Max fell over a second-floor hallway railing, plummeting to the foyer below. The distance was significant. Estimates ranged from 15 to 20 feet. He landed. Rebecca called 911 at 9:17 a.m. The recording of that call reveals a woman in absolute panic. Rebecca's voice trembles, breaks, rises in pitch. She struggles to explain what happened. She tells the dispatcher that Max fell, that he's not breathing, that there's blood. She's crying. She's terrified. The dispatcher tries to calm her, tries to get her to perform CPR. Rebecca attempts it, but she's overwhelmed, frantic. The minutes stretch, elastic with horror, until paramedics arrive. Max was rushed to Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. His injuries were severe fractures, brain bleeding, damage to his spinal cord. Doctors worked frantically, but Max's condition was critical. He was placed on life support, unconscious, fighting for his life. Jonah flew back to San Diego immediately. He went straight to the hospital, where he joined Dina at Max's bedside. The boy they both loved, the innocent child, lay broken and unresponsive. Rebecca visited the hospital briefly on Monday evening. Sources differ on how long she stayed, on what was said between her and Jonah, on what the atmosphere was like. Some accounts suggest Jonah told Rebecca to leave, that Dina didn't want her there. Other accounts suggest Rebecca left voluntarily, understanding that this was a moment for Max's biological parents. Either way, Rebecca returned to the Spreckles mansion alone that night. She would spend the next day and a half there, mostly alone, while Max clung to life in the hospital. And during those hours, something went terribly, inexplicably wrong. July 12, 2011. Tuesday evening into Wednesday morning. Rebecca was alone in the mansion. Well, not entirely alone. Jonah's brother was also on the property, staying in the separate guest house. But in the main mansion itself, Rebecca was the only occupant. The night was warm. Coastal San Diego doesn't get cold in July. The temperature likely hovered in the mid-60s even after sunset. The windows of the mansion were old, the kind that they don't quite seal properly, letting in whispers of the ocean breeze. Rebecca's cell phone records show she was active that evening. She texted. She browsed the internet. At some point she painted her toenails. Investigators would later find the bottle of red nail polish, the cotton balls, the evidence of this ordinary, intimate ritual. She may have been anxious. Max's condition remained critical. The boy might die. And Rebecca had been the only adult present when he fell. That weight, the responsibility, the guilt, the fear of blame, must have pressed on her. But nothing in her phone activity, nothing in the electronic trail she left, suggested suicidal intent. She made plans for the following day. She communicated normally with friends. She searched for medical information about Max's condition, trying to understand his prognosis. At some point, investigators believe between midnight and 3:00 a.m. on July 13, Rebecca's phone went silent. No more texts, no more internet searches, nothing. Adam Shacknai, Jonah's younger brother, on July 13. He later stated he was an early riser, that he'd always been that way. Around 6:30 a.m. he left the guest house and walked toward the main mansion. The morning was quiet, birds singing, the distant sound of waves, palm fronds rustling. And then Adam saw her. Rebecca's body hung from the second-story balcony on the mansion's east side, suspended by an orange rope tied around her neck. The rope was attached to a bed inside the second-story bedroom, looped over the balcony railing, holding her weight. She was completely naked. Her hands were bound behind her back with red rope, her wrists crossed and wrapped multiple times. Her feet were bound together at the ankles, also with red rope, bound so tightly they were touching. She hung there lifeless, pale, her body moving slightly in the morning breeze. Adam later said he immediately ran to her, tried to lift her, tried to free her. He said he cut the rope. He found a knife and cut the orange rope around her neck. He lowered her body to the ground below the balcony. Then he called 911. The call came in at 6:40 a.m. Adam's voice on the recording is urgent, stressed, but notably controlled for someone who just found a hanging body. He tells the dispatcher there's been an accident, that his brother's girlfriend has hung herself. He says he's already cut her down, that she's not breathing. The dispatcher asks if Adam can perform CPR. Adam says he'll try. Paramedics arrived at 6:04 a.m., 6 minutes after the call. They found Adam kneeling beside Rebecca's nude body on the ground. The orange rope still hung from the balcony above, cut at the end where it had held her neck. Rebecca was cold to the touch. No pulse. No respiration. Fixed lividity, the pooling of blood in her lower extremities that occurs after death, was already present. Her body had begun the process of decomposition. She had been dead for hours. Paramedics pronounced Rebecca Zahow dead at the scene at 7:01 a.m. The investigation was about to begin. The Coronado Police Department took the lead, as the death had occurred within their jurisdiction. San Diego Sheriff's Department would later become involved, providing additional resources and expertise. The scene was immediately secured. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the property. Officers began photographing everything, documenting the position of Rebecca's body, the state of the mansion, every detail that might prove relevant. What they found was deeply, disturbingly unusual. Inside the second-story bedroom, the room from which Rebecca had allegedly hung herself, investigators discovered a bizarre tableau. The orange rope that had been around Rebecca's neck was synthetic, approximately 5/8 of an inch thick, the kind of utility rope available at any hardware store. It had been tied to the leg of a heavy bed inside the room, then threaded out through the open balcony door, over the railing and down to where Rebecca's neck would have been positioned. The bed itself was massive, ornate, extremely heavy. It would have taken considerable strength to move. Yet it appeared undisturbed, positioned exactly where it should be. The red rope binding Rebecca's wrists and ankles was also synthetic, thinner than the orange rope, approximately 3/8 of an inch thick. The knots were complex, not simple loops, but intricate bindings that suggested knowledge of rope work or sailing knots. Rebecca's wrists were bound behind her back in a specific configuration, crossed, wrapped multiple times, knotted tightly. Her ankles were similarly bound, wrapped and knotted so her feet were pressed together. On the door of the bedroom, written in black paint on the light-colored wood, was a cryptic message. The letters were uneven, uppercase, stark against the pale door. No punctuation. Just those 7 words, painted in what appeared to be deliberate strokes. The bedroom showed no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds on Rebecca's body, no torn clothing because Rebecca had been naked. Her nightgown was found on the bed, neatly placed as though she'd removed it herself. Her cell phone was on the nightstand, plugged in and charging. The red nail polish was on the bathroom counter, cap-off cotton balls scattered nearby. Rebecca's toenails were painted red, though the polish wasn't quite dry when she died. Investigators photographed the rope configurations. They photographed the message on the door. They photographed Rebecca's body from every angle, documenting the ligature marks on her neck, the bindings on her wrists and ankles, the condition of her skin. Then they began to ask the critical question, could this have been suicide? The San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office conducted the autopsy on July 15, 2011, 2 days after Rebecca's death. Dr. Jonathan Lucas, the deputy medical examiner, performed the examination. His findings: Rebecca died of asphyxiation due to hanging. The ligature furrow, the deep indentation in the skin of her neck where the rope had pressed, was consistent with suspension hanging. There were no other significant injuries, no defensive wounds, no signs of sexual assault. Toxicology tests showed no alcohol. No substances that might have impaired her or rendered her unconscious. Dr. Lucas noted the bindings on Rebecca's wrists and ankles. He observed that while the bindings were tight, they were not so tight as to be impossible for Rebecca to have done herself. He demonstrated, in fact, that it was possible, difficult but possible, for someone to bind their own wrists behind their back, using the technique observed on Rebecca's body. He examined the message on the door. The paint used was from a tube of black acrylic found in the mansion. The brush used was a small paintbrush, also found in the mansion, with traces of the same black paint. Lucas concluded that Rebecca's death was suicide. His report listed the manner of death as suicide, but not everyone agreed. The announcement of the medical examiner's ruling sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Suicide. Rebecca Zahal had bound her own hands behind her back, bound her own feet together, fashioned a noose, placed it around her own neck, and thrown herself off a second-story balcony to hang until dead. And before doing all of this, she had painted a cryptic message on the bedroom door. To many people, this seemed not just unlikely but impossible. Rebecca's family was devastated. Mary Zahal Loener, Rebecca's sister, rejected the suicide ruling immediately and vehemently. She knew her sister Rebecca was not suicidal. Rebecca had never expressed thoughts of self-harm. Rebecca was a devout Christian who believed suicide was a sin. Rebecca had plans, hopes, a future she was building. Mary began asking questions, public questions. The media descended on the case with ravenous intensity. A beautiful woman dead under bizarre circumstances in a billionaire's mansion. The combination was irresistible. Cable news networks ran segments. True crime shows produced episodes. Internet forums exploded with theories and speculation. The Coronado Police Department and the San Diego Sheriff's Department held a joint press conference on September 3, 2011, nearly 2 months after Rebecca's death, to present their findings. Sheriff Bill Gore stood at the podium, flanked by investigators and forensic experts. He methodically laid out the evidence supporting the suicide conclusion. He explained the rope configurations, demonstrating how Rebecca could have bound herself. He presented the lack of forensic evidence suggesting anyone else had been in the room. He cited the absence of defensive wounds, the absence of signs of struggle, the absence of DNA evidence from any other person on the ropes or Rebecca's body. He addressed the message on the door. Investigators believed Rebecca had painted it herself, possibly as a reference to Max's accident. She saved him, referring to Rebecca calling 911 for Max. Can you save her? Perhaps a cry for emotional salvation or help that she felt wasn't coming. Sheriff Gore emphasized that they had investigated thoroughly, that they had considered all possibilities, that the evidence overwhelmingly supported suicide. But even as he spoke, the doubts multiplied. From the moment Rebecca's death became public, attention focused on the people who had been closest to her, the people who had been on or near the property when she died. Jonah Shacknai was the obvious first point of inquiry. The wealthy boyfriend, the man whose home became a death scene, but Jonah had an ironclad alibi. He was at Rady Children's Hospital when Rebecca died, sleeping in a chair beside his dying son's bed. Hospital records, security, staff testimony, all confirmed Jonah never left. He was approximately 20 miles away when Rebecca's body was discovered. Jonah could not have killed Rebecca. That much was certain. Dina Rono, Max's mother and Jonah's ex-wife, also had an alibi. She was at the hospital with Max, just as Jonah was. She too never left. She too was 20 miles away. But then there was Adam Shacknai. Adam was Jonah's younger brother, 54 years old to Jonah's 54. Actually, Adam was born in 1957, making him 53 at the time. He lived in Memphis, Tennessee, where he worked as a tugboat captain on the Mississippi River. He had come to San Diego to support his brother during Max's medical crisis, arriving on Monday, July 11, the day of Max's accident. Adam stayed in the guest house on the Spreckles Mansion property. He was there on the grounds on the night Rebecca died. He was the one who found Rebecca's body. He was the one who cut her down. And he was the only person other than Rebecca herself known to be on the property when she died. Investigators interviewed Adam extensively. They asked him to recount his movements on the night of July 12 into the morning of July 13. Adam's story was straightforward, consistent across multiple tellings. He said he went to bed around 10:30 12:30 p.m. on July 12. He was in the guest house, a separate structure from the main mansion, perhaps 50 yards away. He heard nothing unusual during the night, no screams, no sounds of struggle. He woke early, around 6:00 a.m., as was his habit. He showered, dressed, and decided to go to the main mansion to check if Rebecca wanted to go with him to the hospital to see Max. He walked across the property. As he approached the mansion's east side, he saw Rebecca's body hanging from the balcony. He said his immediate reaction was shock, horror, disbelief. He ran to her, calling her name. He could see she wasn't moving, wasn't responsive. He knew, even before touching her, that she was dead. Her skin was discolored, her body motionless in a way that spoke of absence. But he tried anyway. He said he grabbed her legs, tried to lift her to relieve pressure on her neck. When that didn't work, when he realized the rope was attached above, he ran to find something to cut it with. He found a knife, a kitchen knife from inside the mansion. He used it to cut the orange rope, and Rebecca's body collapsed to the ground. He called 911 immediately. Investigators asked Adam if he had touched anything else in the mansion, if he had been inside the bedroom where the rope originated. Adam said he had not. He said he cut the rope from outside, from ground level, then waited for emergency services. They asked if he had seen the message on the door. Adam said he had not noticed it until investigators pointed it out later. They asked about his relationship with Rebecca. Adam said he barely knew her. He had met her a few times at family gatherings, but they weren't close. He had no reason to wish her harm. They asked if he had any knowledge of Rebecca being suicidal. Adam said no. He said she seemed sad about Max's accident, worried, but not suicidal. Investigators processed Adam's clothing, his shoes, his belongings. They tested his hands for gunshot residue, standard procedure, though no firearm was involved. They swabbed him for DNA. They examined every aspect of his story, and they found nothing that contradicted his account. Adam's DNA was found on the rope, specifically on the portion he had cut. But this was easily explained. He had handled the rope when cutting it down. His fingerprints were on the knife he used, again explained by his stated actions. No other evidence tied Adam to the bedroom, to the bindings, to Rebecca's death. Sheriff Gore stated publicly that Adam Shackney was not a suspect. Adam had cooperated fully with the investigation. His alibi being in the guest house couldn't be proven or disproven, but there was no evidence suggesting he was lying. For the investigators, the case was clear. Rebecca had killed herself in a bizarre and tragic manner. Adam had simply been the unfortunate person to discover her body. But for Rebecca's family, for independent forensic experts who reviewed the case, for the growing chorus of people who smelled something wrong, Adam Shackney's presence on the property that night was deeply troubling. Why was Adam really there? Just to support his brother? Or was there more to it? Had Adam interacted with Rebecca that night? Had they argued? Had something happened that the investigation missed? And most disturbingly, was it really possible for Rebecca to have bound herself so completely, so intricately, and then hanged herself, all while leaving no physical evidence of hesitation, no signs of the struggle such an act would require? As the months passed and the case remained officially closed, independent experts began dissecting the evidence, finding problems, inconsistencies, and unanswered questions. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a renowned forensic pathologist with decades of experience, reviewed the case at the request of Rebecca's family. His conclusions differed sharply from the official findings. Dr. Wecht pointed to the bindings. He argued that the complexity of the knots, particularly on Rebecca's wrists, made it extremely unlikely she had done them herself. The bindings were too tight, too precise, too elaborate for someone working alone with their hands behind their back. He demonstrated that while it was technically possible to bind one's own wrists behind one's back in a simple manner, the specific configuration found on Rebecca required a level of dexterity and leverage that seemed implausible for self-infliction. Wecht also questioned the lack of injury to Rebecca's hands and wrists. When people bind themselves tightly, they typically show some evidence of a struggle, abraded skin, rope burns from adjusting the bindings, some mark of the difficulty involved. Rebecca's wrists showed the ligature marks from the rope, but no secondary injuries suggesting she had struggled to tie herself. Then there was the question of the hanging itself. Rebecca would had to bind her wrists and ankles, fashion the noose, place it around her own neck, and then somehow propel herself over the balcony railing while bound hand and foot. The balcony railing was approximately 4 feet high. Rebecca was 5 feet 3 inches tall. With her feet bound together, she would have had to hop to the railing, then somehow get herself over it. Investigators suggested she might have climbed onto a small table or chair that was on the balcony, then jumped or stepped off. But no furniture on the balcony showed evidence of being used in this way. No disturbed dust patterns, no fibers from Rebecca's feet, no indication that she had stood on anything. Dr. Weck argued that the scenario was biomechanically questionable at best, impossible at worst. Other experts focused on the message painted on the door. Ann Bremner, a Seattle-based attorney and forensic expert who joined Rebecca's family's legal team, questioned the content and positioning of the message. The words "Sechsadikayar" seemed oddly phrased for a suicide note. It was cryptic, almost taunting. Not the kind of direct communication typical of genuine suicide messages. Moreover, the message was on the outside of the bedroom door, the side facing the hallway, not the side facing into the room. If Rebecca had painted it before killing herself, she would have been in the hallway, not in the bedroom. But all the evidence suggested Rebecca's final moments were in the bedroom and on the balcony. Had she painted the message, then returned to the bedroom? It seemed awkward, inefficient. And the paint itself? Investigators found that the tube of black acrylic paint used for the message had Rebecca's DNA on it, supporting the conclusion she had handled it. But Bremner and other experts noted that DNA transfer could occur in numerous ways. Someone else could have used the paint while wearing gloves, and Rebecca's DNA could have been on the tube from previous innocent handling. The lack of paint on Rebecca's hands was also noted. When someone paints a message, especially with their fingers or a small brush in an emotional state, there's usually some transfer of paint to the hands. Rebecca's hands were clean. No black paint residue was found under her fingernails, on her palms, or on her fingers during the autopsy. Could she have washed her hands after painting the message, but before binding herself and hanging? Possibly. But it added another step to an already complicated scenario. Forensic specialists also examined the rope evidence more closely. The orange rope around Rebecca's neck had been cut by Adam Shacknai, so the original knot configuration was destroyed. This meant investigators couldn't definitively determine what kind of knot had been tied, how tight it had been before Rebecca's weight pulled it, or whether the knot showed characteristics of self-tying versus being tied by another person. The red rope on Rebecca's wrists and ankles, however, remained intact. Multiple forensic knot experts examined photographs of these bindings. One expert, J. Keith Riddick, a retired FBI agent with specialized training in knot analysis, stated that the bindings showed characteristics more consistent with being tied by another person than with self-binding. The symmetry of the wraps, the tightness of the final knots, the positioning, all suggested someone working with both hands free, binding someone else's limbs. There was also the question of Rebecca's state of mind. Suicide, especially by such an elaborate method, typically follows a period of deepening depression, expressions of hopelessness, or previous attempts. Rebecca had none of these markers in her history. Her family insisted she had never been suicidal. Harm never exhibited warning signs. Her friends reported the same. Her medical records showed no diagnosis of depression or anxiety, no prescriptions for psychiatric medications. In the days before her death, Rebecca's phone and computer activity showed a woman engaged with life. She was researching Max's medical condition, yes, but also making plans, communicating normally, searching for information about everyday topics. On the night of July 12 hours before her death, Rebecca's internet search history showed her looking up information about traumatic brain injuries in children, clearly concerned about Max. But she was also browsing social media, checking email, conducting normal online activities. Her last text message was sent at 12:50 a.m. on July 13. It was to a friend, a brief message about meeting up later in the week. Not the message of someone planning to die within hours. Then silence. No suicide note beyond the cryptic message on the door. No goodbye text to family. No email explaining her actions. No journal entry expressing despair. just silence and then death. In 2013, 2 years after Rebecca's death, her family took an extraordinary step. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit in civil court against Adam Shacknai. The lawsuit alleged that Adam had killed Rebecca, that her death was not suicide but homicide, and that the investigation had failed to properly pursue this possibility. The Zaha family's legal team, led by Ann Bremner, presented an alternative theory of what happened on the night of July 12 into the morning of July 13, 2011. They theorized that Adam Shacknai had entered the main mansion that night while Rebecca was alone. Perhaps he wanted to talk to her about Max's accident. Perhaps he blamed her for the boy's fall. Perhaps there was confrontation, argument, anger. The theory suggested that Adam attacked Rebecca, possibly in a rage, possibly to punish her for what had happened to Max. He overpowered her, bound her hands and feet to control her, fashioned the noose, and staged her death to look like suicide. The cryptic message on the door in this theory was part of the staging, an attempt to create the appearance that Rebecca had been mentally unstable, consumed by guilt over Max's accident, driven to take her own life in a bizarre ritual of self-punishment. This theory required accepting that Adam had lied to investigators, that he had murdered Rebecca, and then calmly called 911, that he had maintained his innocence despite knowing the truth. It was a dark theory, a disturbing theory, but was it true? The Zaha family's legal team brought in additional experts to support their case. They hired Dr. Judy Malinek, a forensic pathologist from San Francisco, to review the autopsy findings. Dr. Malinek noted several injuries on Rebecca's body than in the original autopsy, but not fully explained. There were small bruises on Rebecca's head, minor abrasions on her neck beyond the ligature furrow, and hemorrhaging in the soft tissues of her neck. Malinek suggested these injuries could be consistent with a struggle, with someone being forcibly controlled before being hanged. The hemorrhaging in the neck, in particular, could indicate trauma beyond simple suspension hanging. The Zaha team also brought in experts to analyze the scene reconstruction. They created detailed diagrams showing the positions of furniture, the trajectory Rebecca would have needed to follow to hang herself, the biomechanical impossibilities involved in binding oneself so thoroughly and then jumping while bound. They presented their evidence in civil court, where the standard of proof is lower than in criminal court, preponderance of evidence, rather than beyond reasonable doubt. Adam Shacknai testified. He maintained his innocence, repeating his account of finding Rebecca's body, cutting her down, calling for help. He denied harming her. He denied even entering the main mansion that night until he saw her hanging in the morning. The trial was contentious, emotional, and widely publicized. Rebecca's family members testified about her character, her faith, her state of mind. They painted a picture of a woman who would never take her own life, especially not in such a grotesque manner. Adam's attorneys argued that the suicide conclusion was correct, that Rebecca had been distraught over Max's accident, that she had blamed herself and acted on that guilt. They presented the same evidence the original investigators had used, emphasizing the lack of physical evidence tying Adam to the crime. On April 13, 2018, nearly 7 years after Rebecca's death, the jury reached a verdict. They found Adam Shacknai responsible for Rebecca Zaha's death. The jury awarded the Zaha family $5 million in damages, later increased to over $6 million with interest and legal fees. It was a stunning reversal of the official suicide ruling. A civil jury had concluded that Rebecca had been killed, and that Adam Shacknai was the killer. But the verdict came with a significant caveat: it was a civil judgment, not a criminal conviction. Adam was found liable for Rebecca's death in civil court, but he was never charged with a crime. The standard of proof in civil court is lower, and the verdict didn't carry criminal penalties, only financial ones. The San Diego Sheriff's Department issued a statement reaffirming their conclusion that Rebecca's death was suicide. They did not reopen the criminal investigation. They maintained that the evidence supported suicide, and that the civil verdict didn't change the facts of the case. Adam Shacknai appealed the verdict. His legal team argued that the jury had been swayed by emotion rather than evidence, that the wrongful death lawsuit had been a miscarriage of justice. The appeal was denied. The verdict stood. But still, no criminal charges were filed. Adam Shacknai remained a free man, legally liable for Rebecca's death in civil court but never prosecuted criminally. The contradiction was stark, troubling, and unresolved. How could a man be found responsible for a death by one court system while another system declared that same death as suicide? The Rebecca Zahaw case remains one of the most polarizing death investigations in recent American history. On one side stand those who accept the official ruling suicide. They point to the forensic evidence, the lack of DNA from another person, the absence of signs of forced entry or struggle. They argue that Rebecca, overwhelmed by guilt and grief over Max's accident, took her own life in a moment of psychological crisis. The bizarre staging, the bindings, the nudity, the message, reflected her disturbed mental state, her desire for punishment, her cry for help that came too late. On the other side stand those who believe Rebecca was murdered. They point to the biomechanical improbability of the suicide scenario, the complexity of the bindings, the suspicious presence of Adam Shacknai on the property, the civil jury's verdict. They argue that Rebecca was killed, that the investigation was flawed or incomplete, that justice has been denied. Between these two positions lies a chasm of uncertainty, a gap filled with questions that may never be answered. What really happened in the Spreckels mansion on the night of July 12, 2011? Was Rebecca Zahaw a deeply troubled woman who hid her pain so well that no one, not her family, not her friends, not her boyfriend, saw the warning signs? Or was she the victim of a violent crime, her death staged to look like suicide by someone who knew the house, who had opportunity, who had motive? And what about Max Shacknai, the little boy whose accident preceded Rebecca's death by just 2 days? Max died on July 16, 2011, at Rady Children's Hospital. He was taken off life support after doctors determined his brain injuries were catastrophic and irreversible. He was 6 years old. His death was ruled accidental. But questions linger there, too. How exactly did Max fall? Rebecca was the only adult present, but she gave conflicting accounts in the chaos of the 9/11 call and immediate aftermath. Some investigators wondered if there was more to Max's accident than a simple fall. Some wondered if Rebecca's death was somehow connected to the circumstances of Max's injuries, if someone blamed her, if someone wanted revenge. Jonah Shacknai has remained largely silent on Rebecca's death. He has stated publicly that he believes the investigation was thorough, that he accepts the suicide ruling. He has not spoken extensively about his personal feelings, his grief, his thoughts on the civil verdict against his brother. Dina Romano, Max's mother, has also maintained a low profile. Her son's death and Rebecca's death, occurring within days of each other, created a nightmare of loss and speculation. She has not publicly weighed in on whether she believes Rebecca's death was suicide or homicide. Adam Shacknai continues to deny any involvement in Rebecca's death. He has given interviews proclaiming his innocence, expressing frustration with what he sees as a rush to judgment based on circumstantial evidence and emotion. He maintains that he was simply an unlucky bystander, a man who happened to find a suicide victim and now bears the unfair burden of suspicion. Rebecca's family continues to seek justice. Mary Zahaw Loener has become an advocate for victims' rights, speaking publicly about her sister's case, pushing for further investigation, refusing to let Rebecca's story fade into obscurity. The message painted on the door of that bedroom in the Spreckels mansion still haunts anyone who studies this case. Was it a cry for help, a statement of guilt, a taunt from a killer? We may never know. The years following the civil trial verdict brought new developments, new investigations, and new controversies to the Rebecca Zahaw case. What had begun as a tragic death in a mansion became a symbol of broader questions about justice, investigative thoroughness, and the treatment of immigrant victims in the American legal system. In 2018, shortly after the civil jury found Adam Shacknai liable for Rebecca's death, the Zahaw family made another bold move. They hired a private investigation firm to conduct an independent review of the evidence, to examine everything the official investigation had touched, and to look for what it might have missed. The firm brought in specialists from multiple disciplines: forensic pathologists, crime scene reconstructionists, DNA analysts, psychological profilers, and experts in autoerotic asphyxiation and unusual suicide methods. Their goal was comprehensive: to either definitively prove the suicide theory or to build an irrefutable case for homicide. What they found complicated the picture even further. The independent investigators began with the physical evidence, starting with the ropes. The orange rope that had been around Rebecca's neck was 3-strand twisted synthetic rope, the kind sold at hardware stores across America. Investigators traced purchases of similar rope at stores near Coronado in the days and weeks before Rebecca's death, but found no definitive connection to either Rebecca or Adam Shacknai. The rope was simply too common to trace to a specific buyer. The red rope used to bind Rebecca's wrists and ankles was also synthetic, slightly thinner, also commercially available. Both ropes appeared new or nearly new, no significant weathering, no fraying beyond what would be expected from tying knots. Where had these ropes come from? The original investigation had determined that both ropes were present in the Spreckles mansion before Rebecca's death, stored in a garage or utility area where various household items were kept. Jonah Shacknai owned a boat, and rope is common among boat owners. The presence of rope on the property wasn't suspicious in itself, but the independent investigators wanted to know, had Rebecca known where these ropes were stored? Would she have known to look for them if she were planning suicide? They interviewed people who had visited the mansion, who had worked there, who knew the layout. The consensus was that the utility areas were not places Rebecca frequented. She wasn't involved in boat maintenance or household repairs. It was possible she knew about the ropes, but far from certain. This raised a question: if Rebecca didn't know where the ropes were, how did she obtain them for her alleged suicide? And if someone else obtained the ropes, someone who did know the property well, that suggested premeditation, planning, a scenario inconsistent with suicide. The independent team also re-examined the knots themselves in greater detail than the original investigation had managed. Multiple forensic knot experts were brought in. They examined high-resolution photographs of the bindings on Rebecca's wrists and ankles from every angle. The experts identified the specific knots used. The wrist binding involved a technique called a reverse wrap, where the rope circles the wrists multiple times before being tied off. The knot itself was a variation of a square knot, tied with precision and symmetry. The ankle binding was simpler but equally tight, using a basic lashing technique to keep Rebecca's feet pressed together. What struck the experts was the consistency and tightness of the bindings. When people bind themselves, even in cases of autoerotic asphyxiation, where self-binding is part of the activity, there's usually some asymmetry, some evidence of awkwardness, because working with one's hands in uncomfortable positions leads to imperfect results. Rebecca's bindings showed professional-level precision. One expert, a former Navy SEAL with extensive experience in rope work and restraint techniques, stated flatly that, in his opinion, the bindings were done by someone else. He demonstrated that while it was technically possible to achieve such bindings alone, it would require multiple attempts, leaving evidence of false starts. Loosened rope fibers, abraded skin from adjusting the position, some sign of trial and error. Rebecca's bindings showed none of that. They appeared to be done correctly on the first attempt. The independent investigators then turned to the autopsy findings, specifically the injuries that had been noted but not fully explained. Dr. Judy Malinek, the forensic pathologist hired by the Zahal family, conducted a detailed review of the autopsy photographs and reports. She identified several findings that troubled her. First, there were 4 small areas of hemorrhaging on Rebecca's scalp, beneath the skin but above the skull. These were consistent with blunt force trauma, someone being struck or someone's head being forcibly pushed against a hard surface. The original autopsy had noted these hemorrhages but attributed them to possible contact with the balcony or the ground when Adam cut Rebecca down. Dr. Malinek disagreed. She argued that the pattern and location of the hemorrhages were more consistent with trauma that occurred before death, possibly during a struggle. Second, there were petechial hemorrhages in Rebecca's eyes, small burst blood vessels that can occur during strangulation or asphyxiation. These were consistent with hanging, but Malinek noted that the extensive nature of the petechia suggested prolonged asphyxiation, possibly longer than would be expected if Rebecca had simply jumped from the balcony and died quickly. This raised the possibility that Rebecca had been strangled or asphyxiated before being hanged, that the hanging was post-mortem staging rather than the actual cause of death. However, Dr. Malinik acknowledged this was speculative. The petechial hemorrhages could be explained by the hanging alone, especially if Rebecca had struggled or if the hanging had taken several minutes to cause death rather than being instantaneous. Third, there were minor abrasions on Rebecca's neck, separate from the main ligature furrow. These abrasions were small, almost insignificant, but their presence suggested possible grabbing or grasping at the neck before the rope was applied. Again, this was not conclusive. The abrasions could have occurred if Rebecca had touched her own neck, adjusting the rope or experiencing the moment of panic before jumping. But taken together, the scalp hemorrhages, the petechiae, the neck abrasions, Dr. Malinik argued that the injuries painted a picture of struggle, of violence, of someone being overpowered rather than someone calmly proceeding with a planned suicide. The independent team also commissioned a biomechanical analysis of the hanging itself. They built a precise model of the balcony, measuring every dimension, calculating the height of the railing, the distance to the ground below, the angle at which the rope would have hung based on where it was attached to the bed inside. Then they used a mannequin matching Rebecca's height and weight to test the suicide scenario. With hands bound behind the back and feet bound together, could the mannequin be positioned in a way that would allow it to go over the balcony railing? The answer was barely, and only with significant difficulty. The mannequin had to be propped against the railing at a very specific angle, then tipped forward with considerable force to overcome the balance point. A human attempting this would need to commit fully, to essentially throw themselves forward with enough momentum to overcome their natural instinct to pull back. Possible, yes, likely. The biomechanical experts were skeptical. They noted that people who die by hanging typically use one of a few common methods: stepping off a chair or stool, jumping from a height with a noose already secured, or slowly leaning forward while seated or kneeling until the noose tightens. Rebecca's method, bound hand and foot, throwing herself over a 4-foot railing, was virtually unprecedented in suicide literature. The independent investigators searched databases of suicide cases, consulted with experts around the world. Looking for similar cases, they found a handful of suicides involving self-binding, usually in the context of autoerotic asphyxiation gone wrong. But in those cases, the binding was typically part of the sexual activity, not a preparation for hanging, and the victims were almost always male. They found no cases, zero, of a woman binding her own hands and feet and then hanging herself by jumping over a balcony. This didn't prove Rebecca's death was homicide. Absence of precedent isn't proof of impossibility. But it reinforced the doubts. The independent team brought in Dr. Philip Resnick, a professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University and an expert in forensic psychiatry, to develop a psychological profile of Rebecca in the days and hours before her death. Dr. Resnick reviewed everything available: Rebecca's text messages, her internet search history, her email communications, interviews with people who knew her medical records, her work history, her financial records. He was looking for signs of suicidal ideation, depression, hopelessness, or psychological crisis. What he found was a woman under stress, certainly. Rebecca was worried about Max. She was searching information about pediatric traumatic brain injury, reading medical articles trying to understand the boy's prognosis. But Dr. Resnick found no evidence of depression. Rebecca's communications were normal in tone. She made plans for the future. She had arranged to have dinner with friends later in the week. She had discussed upcoming work shifts with colleagues. She had texted her sister about visiting Missouri in the coming months. Her internet search history showed no research into suicide methods, no visits to websites about depression or mental health crisis, no indication she was contemplating self-harm. In fact, Rebecca's final internet searches before her phone went silent were mundane. She had looked at Facebook, checked her email, browsed a news website, searched for information about Max's medical condition. Dr. Resnick noted that while people can hide suicidal thoughts, there are usually warning signs, behavioral changes that become apparent in retrospect. Friends and family of suicide victims often recall that the person seemed withdrawn, or gave away possessions, or made statements about being a burden, or exhibited other red flags. No one in Rebecca's life reported any such signs. Her family insisted she was not depressed. Her friends said the same. Her coworkers noticed no change in her demeanor in the days before her death. Even allowing for the stress of Max's accident, even considering the possibility that Rebecca blamed herself for the boy's fall, Resnick concluded that the evidence did not support a diagnosis of acute suicidal crisis. People under stress typically reach out for support, seek comfort, try to process their emotions. Rebecca had done none of these things. She hadn't called her sister. She hadn't texted friends expressing despair. She hadn't left any record of the emotional turmoil that would be expected to precede such a dramatic suicide. Dr. Resnick's conclusion, while he couldn't rule out suicide definitively, Rebecca's psychological profile was not consistent with someone planning to take her own life. The independent investigators also explored another angle: cultural factors. Rebecca came from the Chin community, a tight-knit cultural group with strong religious beliefs. In Chin culture, suicide is considered deeply shameful, a sin that brings dishonor to the entire family. Dr. Resnick consulted with cultural experts familiar with the Chin people. They confirmed that suicide was extraordinarily rare in this community, viewed as perhaps the worst possible action a person could take. Rebecca was a devout Christian active in her church community. She carried a Bible, attended services regularly, and spoke often of her faith. For someone with Rebecca's cultural and religious background to commit suicide, especially in such a bizarre, degrading manner, would represent a complete break with her identity and values. Again, this didn't prove homicide. People in crisis sometimes act in ways that contradict their deepest belief. But it was another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit comfortably with the suicide theory. The independent investigation inevitably circled back to Adam Shacknai. If Rebecca had been killed, Adam was the only person known to be on the property that night who had opportunity. But what about motive? The civil trial had touched on this, but the independent investigators dug deeper, looking for any connection, any reason Adam might have wanted Rebecca dead. One theory centered on Max's accident. According to this theory, Adam blamed Rebecca for what happened to Max. Perhaps he believed Rebecca had been negligent, that she had failed to supervise the boy properly, that her carelessness had led to the fall that would ultimately kill his nephew. The theory suggested that Adam, in grief and rage over Max's critical condition, confronted Rebecca. Perhaps he intended only to scare her, to make her confess to negligence, to extract some admission of guilt. But the confrontation escalated, violence erupted, and in the aftermath, Adam panicked and staged the suicide. This theory had problems. First, Adam had no history of violence. He was a tugboat captain, a working-class man who lived a quiet life in Memphis. He had no criminal record, no history of aggressive behavior, no prior allegations of violence. If Adam blamed Rebecca for Max's accident, why wait until the night of July 13? Max had fallen on July 11. Adam had been on the property since that evening. He had opportunities to confront Rebecca earlier if that was his intent. Third, the staging would have required remarkable coldness and calculation. To kill someone in a rage, then calmly bind their body, fashion a noose, hang them from a balcony, paint a cryptic message, that suggested a level of premeditation and control that seemed inconsistent with a crime of passion. But the investigators found another possible angle: financial motive. Jonah Shacknai was extremely wealthy. If he and Rebecca had married, she would have been entitled to a significant portion of his assets in the event of divorce. If Jonah died while married to Rebecca, she would have inherited a fortune. Could Adam have killed Rebecca to protect his brother's wealth, to prevent a woman he saw as a gold digger from claiming Jonah's money? This theory was even more speculative. There was no evidence Adam was involved in Jonah's financial affairs. There was no evidence Jonah had asked Adam to intervene in any way. There was no evidence Rebecca was planning to marry Jonah imminently, or that she had mercenary intentions. But the theory persisted in some circles, fueled by the uncomfortable reality that wealthy men's families sometimes view the women they date with suspicion, especially when those women come from different cultural or economic backgrounds. The investigators also explored whether Adam might have had personal reasons to target Rebecca, perhaps an unrequited attraction, perhaps a rejected advance, Perhaps some interaction that had gone wrong. They found nothing. Adam and Rebecca barely knew each other. They had met perhaps 3 or 4 times at family gatherings before July 2011. There was no record of private communications between them. No phone calls or texts, no evidence of any relationship beyond polite acquaintance. If Adam had killed Rebecca, the motive remained elusive. But opportunity was undeniable. Adam was there. He was on the property. He had access to the main mansion. The doors weren't locked, security wasn't tight. He was family and could move freely. If he had entered the mansion that night, if he had gone to Rebecca's room, if something had happened, there would be no one to contradict his account. Rebecca was dead, and Adam was the only witness. The independent investigators developed a detailed reconstruction of how Rebecca's death could have occurred if it were indeed homicide. Their scenario went like this. Sometime between midnight and 3:00 a.m. on July 13, Adam entered the main mansion. Perhaps he knocked, perhaps he simply walked in. Rebecca, awake and perhaps still reaching Max's condition online, encountered him. There was a confrontation, maybe about Max. Maybe about something else entirely, something we'll never know. The confrontation became physical. Adam, larger and stronger than Rebecca, overpowered her. Perhaps he struck her, causing the scalp hemorrhages. Perhaps he grabbed her throat, causing the minor abrasions on her neck. Rebecca may have screamed. But the mansion was large, the walls thick. The guest house 50 yards away. If Adam was in the guest house, he later claimed he heard nothing. Convenient. Once Rebecca was possibly unconscious from a blow to the head or from strangulation, Adam faced a choice. Call for help and admit what had happened, or cover it up. He chose cover up. He bound Rebecca's wrists and ankles using rope he knew was on the property. As a tugboat captain, Adam would have been familiar with knots, with rope work, with the mechanics of securing objects. He fashioned the noose from the orange rope. He attached it to the bed leg inside the bedroom. Then, and this is where the scenario becomes truly dark, he placed the noose around Rebecca's neck while she was unconscious or already dead. He positioned her on the balcony. He pushed her over the railing, letting her body drop until the rope caught her weight and she hung suspended. If Rebecca was still alive at this point, the hanging would have completed what the attack had started. If she was already dead, the hanging was pure staging. Then Adam painted the message on the door. Ashi Savi him kai X statement that would suggest mental instability, that would point towards suicide, that would deflect from the possibility of murder. He cleaned up. He removed any evidence of his presence. He returned to the guest house. He waited. In the morning, he discovered Rebecca's body. He cut her down, contaminating the scene, destroying evidence, making it impossible to destroy original knot configuration on the noose. He called 911, playing the role of shocked finder, good Samaritan trying desperately to save her, and he maintained that role ever since. This scenario fit the physical evidence. It explained the precise bindings, the lack of suicide ideation, the biomechanical problems with the hanging, the scalp hemorrhages, the neck abrasions. But it was still just a theory. Without confession, without witnesses, without definitive forensic proof, it remained speculation. And Adam Shacknai has never confessed. Not everyone who doubted the suicide theory believed Adam was guilty. Some investigators and theorists proposed a different scenario: an unknown intruder. The Spreckles mansion, for all its grandeur, was not a fortress. The property had gates, but they weren't always locked. The mansion itself had multiple entrances. Security cameras were limited. They didn't cover all approaches to the property. Could someone else have entered the property that night? Someone with a grudge against Rebecca. Someone with a connection to Max's accident. Someone we don't know about. This theory was harder to construct because it required inventing a suspect from whole cloth. But it wasn't impossible. Rebecca was a beautiful woman. She worked in a medical office where she interacted with patients daily. Could one of those patients have become obsessed with her? Could there have been a stalker the investigation never uncovered? Or could the intruder have been connected to Jonah, a business rival? Someone who wanted to hurt Jonah by targeting the woman he loved? Or could have been connected to Max's accident in some way? Perhaps someone who believed Rebecca was responsible for Max's fall and wanted revenge. The problem with the unknown intruder theory was the complete lack of evidence. No DNA from an unknown person was found in the bedroom. No fingerprints, no shoe prints, no hair or fiber evidence suggesting someone other than Rebecca and Adam had been present. The mansion's limited security footage showed no vehicles arriving during the night, no movement in the areas the cameras covered. If an intruder had been present, they left no trace. Most investigators, even those who doubted the suicide theory, found the unknown intruder scenario too speculative to take seriously. The evidence pointed to either suicide or to someone who was on the property legitimately, who had access, who had opportunity. That meant Adam. Or it meant accepting the official conclusion Rebecca had killed herself. Perhaps no single piece of evidence has generated more debate than the message painted on the bedroom door. 7 words, no punctuation. Black paint on pale wood. What did it mean? The official investigation interpreted it as Rebecca's suicide note, a cryptic expression of her guilt over Max's accident and her cry for help that went unanswered. She saved him, referred to Rebecca calling 911 for Max. Can you save her? Was Rebecca asking rhetorically if anyone could save her from her guilt and despair. But critics pointed out problems with this interpretation. If Rebecca was asking to be saved, who was she asking? The message was on the outside of the door, facing the hallway. If it was meant to be found, why paint it in a location where it might not be seen immediately? Moreover, the phrasing was strange. English was not Rebecca's first language, but she was fluent. Would she have written such an awkwardly phrased message? Alternative interpretations emerged. Some believed she and M didn't refer to Rebecca and Max at all, but to other people entirely. Perhaps biblical figures Mary and Jesus. She saved him, can you save her? Others thought the message was a taunt from a killer, a cryptic riddle left to confuse investigators, to create exactly the kind of ambiguity and debate it has generated. Still others believed the message was staged by someone trying to suggest Rebecca was mentally unstable, that she was experiencing a religious or psychological crisis that would explain a bizarre suicide. Handwriting analysts were brought in to examine the painted letters, comparing them to samples of Rebecca's handwriting. The results were inconclusive. Painting with a brush is different from writing with a pen, and the letter formation was crude enough that definitive attribution was impossible. The paint itself, the tube of black acrylic, had Rebecca's DNA on it. But as previously noted, this could be explained by innocent prior handling. No paintbrush was found with Rebecca's DNA on the handle. The brush used to paint the message was found, but it had been wiped clean. Suspicious in itself. Why wipe the brush clean if you're about to commit suicide? The message remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case, a Rorschach test onto which people project their own interpretations of what happened that night. As the investigation continued to unfold in the public sphere, driven by media attention and the Zahau family's relentless pursuit of answers, new witnesses began to come forward. Some had information that had been overlooked in the original investigation. Others had observations that, while seemingly minor at the time, took on new significance in light of the questions surrounding Rebecca's death. In 2019, a former neighbor of the Spreckles mansion contacted the Zahau family's legal team with information that had been troubling her for years. The woman, whose identity was protected but who lived within sight of the mansion in July 2011, stated that she had been awake in the early morning hours of July 13. She suffered from insomnia, she explained, and often spent the hours between 20:00 and 40:00 a.m. looking out her window at the ocean. On that particular night, she claimed to have seen lights moving inside the Spreckles mansion. Not the steady illumination of rooms with lights on, but the movement of a flashlight or handheld light source moving from room to room. She thought it was odd at the time, but assumed someone in the house was simply moving around during the night. She didn't call police. She didn't think much of it, until she heard about Rebecca's death. Then the moving lights took on sinister significance. Why would someone be using a flashlight inside their own home in the mid of the night? Why not simply turn on the lights? The neighbor's testimony suggested someone had been moving through the mansion trying not to be noticed, trying not to alert anyone to their presence. This information had not been included in the original investigation. When pressed, Investigators admitted the neighbor had mentioned seeing lights, but they had dismissed it as irrelevant. Probably Rebecca herself moving around the house. But if it was Rebecca, why use a flashlight? Another witness came forward with a different observation. An employee who had worked on the Spreckles property doing landscaping maintenance testified that he had interacted with Adam Shackney on the afternoon of July 12, just hours before Rebecca's death. The landscaper said Adam had asked him about the property's layout, specifically about whether there were security cameras covering all areas of the grounds. Adam had seemed particularly interested in blind spots, areas where someone could move without being recorded. The landscaper thought it was a security, conscious question at the time, nothing more. But in retrospect, it seemed suspicious. Why would Adam care about security camera coverage unless he was planning something he didn't want recorded? The landscaper's testimony was circumstantial at best, but it added to the growing collection of small details that, taken together, painted a picture of premeditation rather than suicide. A third witness, a person who had been friends with both Jonah and his brother Adam, came forward with observations about Adam's demeanor in the weeks following Rebecca's death. This witness, speaking anonymously, stated that Adam had seemed surprisingly unemotional about the tragedy. While Jonah was devastated, having lost both his son and his girlfriend within days, Adam appeared detached, almost clinical in his discussions of the events. The witness recalled a conversation in which Adam had described finding Rebecca's body in disturbingly detailed terms, recounting the color of her skin, the position of her limbs, the way the rope had dug into her neck, details that seemed inappropriate for casual conversation, details that suggested either trauma or fascination rather than appropriate grief. Again, this was subjective. People process trauma differently. Some become emotional. Others withdraw into clinical detachment. Adam's response could be explained as shock, as his coping mechanism, as nothing more sinister than an unfortunate personality quirk, but the witness felt it was worth reporting, and the Zahow family's legal team added it to their growing file of troubling details. As investigators re-examined Rebecca's death, some began to question the circumstances of Max Shackney's accident as well. The official ruling was clear: Max had accidentally fallen over a second-floor hallway railing while playing or running. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. But the details of the fall were sparse, based almost entirely on Rebecca's frantic 911 call and her initial statements to paramedics. Rebecca had said Max was running, that he somehow went over the railing, that she heard a crash and found him on the floor below. But the exact mechanics, how a 6-year-old boy running in a hallway ends up going over a railing that was approximately 42 inches high, were never fully explained. Some investigators began to wonder if Max's fall had been as simple as reported. The layout of the hallway was examined in detail. The railing was substantial, not something a child running at normal speed would easily flip over. For Max to have gone over it, he would have needed significant upward and forward in the railing. Was he climbing on the railing? The original investigation suggested this possibility, but found no evidence, no scuff marks on the railing, no indication Max had been playing on it. Was he pushed? This darker theory suggested that someone had caused Max's fall, either accidentally or deliberately, and that Rebecca's death was connected to this, either as punishment for failing to protect Max, or to silence her if she knew something about how Max really fell. But this theory required a level of conspiracy that seemed far-fetched. If someone other than Rebecca had been present when Max fell, who and why had Rebecca not mentioned it? The most troubling aspect of Max's accident was the timing. It occurred and died on July 13. 2 days later, Max died on July 16. 3 deaths and near deaths in one family in less than a week seemed like more than coincidence to some observers. But investigators who re-examined Max's accident found no evidence of foul play. The injuries were consistent with a fall from height. The hospital staff noted no suspicious circumstances. Max's death was the explicable result of catastrophic brain trauma. Most likely, Max's fall was exactly what it appeared to be, a horrible accident. But the proximity in time to Rebecca's death would forever link the two events, making it impossible to fully separate one tragedy from the other. As criticism of the original investigation mounted, The Coronado Police Department and the San Diego Sheriff's Department found themselves on the defensive. In multiple public statements and press conferences, investigators stood by their conclusions. They argued that the evidence overwhelmingly supported suicide, that they had investigated thoroughly, that the critics were second, guessing without understanding the full context. Sheriff Bill Gore gave an extensive interview in 2018, shortly after the civil verdict against Adam Shacknai, in which he defended the investigation point by point. On the bindings, Gore stated that experts had demonstrated Rebecca could have bound herself, that it was difficult but possible, and that absence of precedent didn't mean impossibility. On the message, Gore argued it was clearly a suicide note, expressing Rebecca's guilt and despair in a cryptic but understandable way. On the lack of suicide ideation, Gore pointed out that many suicide victims hide their intentions, that the absence of warning signs is not unusual, especially in cases where guilt and shame are driving factors. On Adam Shacknai's presence, Gore noted that Adam had cooperated fully, that his DNA and fingerprints were found only where his own account placed them, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the bedroom or to Rebecca's death. Gore emphasized that the investigation had lasted months, had involved multiple agencies and dozens of investigators, had utilized the best forensic resources available. The conclusion wasn't reached lightly or quickly. He also noted that the civil trial verdict, while emotionally significant for the Zahau family, was based on a lower standard of proof than criminal court and didn't change the physical evidence. The San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office also issued statements supporting the original autopsy findings. They acknowledged that forensic pathology involves interpretation, that experts can disagree, but that Dr. Lucas's conclusion of suicide was reasonable and supported by the evidence. But the defense of the investigation did little to quiet the critics. Aine Bremner, the attorney representing the Zahau family, gave her own interviews and press conferences, countering the official narrative point by point. She argued that the investigation had been rushed to conclusion, that investigators had latched onto the suicide theory early, and then looked for evidence to support it rather than following the evidence wherever it led. She pointed out that Adam Shacknai had not been subjected to the kind of intensive interrogation that would be standard in a homicide investigation. He had been interviewed, yes, but treated as a witness rather than a suspect. Bremner noted that Adam's story, that he had cut Rebecca down immediately upon finding her, had contaminated the scene, destroying evidence that might have proven homicide. Whether this was innocent impulse or calculated destruction of evidence was impossible to determine, but it was convenient for Adam that the original rope configuration was lost. She also highlighted what she saw as investigative failures, the lack of thorough DNA analysis of the ropes, the failure to examine Rebecca's fingernails for defensive wounds more carefully, the quick acceptance of the suicide theory without exploring alternatives. The public debate became heated, personal, accusatory. Each side accused the other of bias, of incompetence, of letting predetermined conclusions drive their interpretations. And in the middle of this storm of accusation and counter-accusation, the truth remained elusive. The Rebecca Zahau case became a fixture on true crime television. Dateline, NBC, 48 Hours, 2020. All the major investigative journalism programs produced episodes on the case. Dr. Phil devoted multiple episodes to the case, interviewing Rebecca's family, bringing in experts, dissecting the evidence for his audience. Podcasts dedicated entire seasons to the case, with hosts breaking down every detail, interviewing witnesses, presenting theories ranging from plausible to wildly speculative. The case had all the elements that drive true crime: interest, wealth, beauty, mystery, sex, death, and most importantly, ambiguity. There was no clear answer, no satisfying resolution. People could argue endlessly about what really happened, and they did. Internet forums exploded with theories. Reddit threads ran to thousands of comments. Facebook groups formed to discuss the case, with members divided into pro-suicide and pro-homicide camps, arguing with passion that sometimes bordered on obsession. Some people became convinced they had solved the case, that they had identified the one piece of evidence that proved Rebecca was murdered or proved she committed suicide. They wrote elaborate posts, created diagrams, analyzed photographs pixel by pixel looking for hidden clues. The Spreckels mansion itself became a dark tourist destination. People would drive to Coronado, park outside the property, take photographs. Some even tried to enter the grounds before being turned away by security or police. The mansion was sold in 2013, 2 years after the deaths. The new owners, aware of the property's dark history, installed better security and tried to maintain privacy. But the address was public knowledge, and the curious kept coming. Rebecca's story had transcended the bounds of a simple death investigation. It had become a cultural phenomenon, a modern mystery that captured the public imagination in the way that only the most enigmatic cases do. But for Rebecca's family, the media attention was a double-edged sword. It kept the case in the public eye, maintained pressure for further investigation, prevented the story from being forgotten. But it also meant living with the constant reopening of wounds, the endless rehashing of painful details, the knowledge that Rebecca's death had become entertainment for millions of strangers. Mary Zahau Lohner gave numerous interviews, always composed, always articulate, always insisting on her sister's innocence of suicide. She became the public face of the family for justice, appearing on television programs, speaking at press conferences, refusing to let Rebecca's story fade. In one particularly moving interview, Mary spoke about Rebecca's dreams, her hopes, the life she had built and the future that had been stolen from her. "My sister did not kill herself," Mary said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I knew her. I knew her heart. I knew her faith. She would never do this. And I will fight until my last breath to find out what really happened to her." The civil trial verdict in April 2018, finding Adam Shacknai liable for Rebecca's death and awarding the Zahau family over $6 million, created a host of new legal complications. Adam immediately announced his intention to appeal. His attorneys argued that the verdict was based on emotion rather than evidence, that the jury had been swayed by sympathy for the Zhao family, rather than by objective analysis of the facts. The appeal process took years, moving through the California court system with the grinding slowness characteristic of complex civil litigation. In November 2020, the California Court of Appeal rejected Adam's appeal. The verdict stood. Adam Shacknai was legally liable for Rebecca Zahau's death, but collecting the judgment proved difficult. Adam claimed he didn't have the money to pay. His assets were limited, he argued. He was a working-class tugboat captain, not a wealthy pharmaceutical executive like his brother. The Zahau family's attorneys pursued collection efforts, trying to identify assets that could be seized to satisfy the judgment. But Adam had apparently structured his finances in ways that made collection challenging. Some observers suspected that Jonah Shacknai, with his vast wealth, was helping his brother behind the scenes, paying legal fees, shielding assets, ensuring Adam wouldn't face financial ruin. But there was no proof of this, and Jonah maintained public silence on the matter. The civil verdict, for all its symbolic importance, didn't bring the closure the Zahau family had hoped for. Adam remained free, uncharged with any crime, living his life while Rebecca remained dead and the questions remained unanswered. The verdict also didn't change the official ruling. The San Diego Sheriff's Department continued to classify Rebecca's death as suicide. The case remained closed. No criminal charges were filed. This created a bizarre legal paradox. A man found civilly liable for causing a death that the state officially classified as suicide. Two different legal systems had reached two different conclusions about the same event, and there was no mechanism to reconcile them. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the Rebecca Zahau case is the disagreement among legitimate experts with impressive credentials who've examined the same evidence and reached opposite conclusions. On one side, Dr. Jonathan Lucas, the deputy medical examiner who performed the autopsy and concluded suicide. He was supported by other forensic pathologists who reviewed the case and agreed with his findings. On the other side, Dr. Cyril Weck, Dr. Judy Malinik, and other forensic experts who concluded the evidence was more consistent with homicide. Both sides had extensive experience, advanced degrees, decades of practice. Both sides could point to specific evidence supporting their conclusions. This wasn't a case of quacks versus credentialed experts. These were all serious professionals with legitimate expertise. So why did they disagree so profoundly? Part of the answer lies in the nature of forensic science itself. Despite the certainty often portrayed on television crime dramas, much of forensic analysis involves interpretation, judgment, and probability rather than absolute certainty. An injury can be consistent with multiple causes. A piece of evidence can support different theories. The absence of something doesn't always prove anything. In Rebecca's case, almost every piece of evidence was subject to multiple interpretations. The bindings could be self-inflicted or applied by another person. Both were possible. The message could be a suicide note or a staging element. Both were plausible. The hanging could be suicide or postmortem staging. Both scenarios had supporting arguments. The scalp hemorrhages could be from the fall when Adam cut her down or from an earlier assault. Both explanations fit. When evidence is ambiguous, experts rely on their experience, their judgment, their sense of likely given the totality of circumstances. And different experts, with different experiences and different perspectives, can reasonably reach different conclusions. This ambiguity is maddening for those seeking definitive answers, but it reflects the reality of many death investigations. The evidence tells us what might have happened, but not always what definitely happened. In Rebecca's case, the evidence was sufficient to convince some experts of suicide and other experts of homicide. And without new evidence, a confession, a witness coming forward, some previously undiscovered physical proof, the disagreement would likely continue indefinitely. Where evidence is ambiguous and official conclusions are disputed, conspiracy theories inevitably flourish. The Rebecca Zaha case spawned numerous theories, some based on logical extension of existing evidence, others venturing into pure speculation. One persistent theory suggested that Rebecca's death was connected to Jonah Shacknai's pharmaceutical business. According to this theory, Rebecca had discovered something about Jonah's company, fraud, illegal practices, dangerous cover-ups, and was killed to keep her silent. This theory had some superficial appeal. Pharmaceutical companies have been involved in scandals. Whistleblowers have been targeted. The wealthy and powerful do sometimes commit crimes to protect their interests. But there was no evidence supporting this theory. Rebecca didn't work for Jonah's company. She had no access to proprietary information. There was no indication she had discovered anything problematic, or that she had threatened to go public with any information. The theory was based entirely on speculation and the vague notion that pharmaceutical executives might be capable of murder. It didn't hold up to scrutiny. Another theory suggested that Dina Romano, Max's mother, was somehow involved in Rebecca's death. The theory proposed that Dina blamed Rebecca for Max's accident and either killed Rebecca herself or arranged for someone else to do it. But Dina had an ironclad alibi. She was at the hospital with Max 20 miles away when Rebecca died. Security footage and hospital records confirm this absolutely. Unless Dina had hired a professional killer, a scenario that seemed wildly implausible and for which there was zero evidence, she couldn't have been directly involved. A third theory, even more speculative, suggested that Rebecca had been involved in Max's fall more directly than the official account indicated, that she had pushed him or dropped him, and that her death was either suicide driven by guilt or murder committed as revenge. This theory required believing that Rebecca, the gentlewoman described by everyone who knew her, had intentionally or recklessly harmed a child. It also required believing that she would then kill herself in such an elaborate way, or that someone would murder her while making it look like an elaborate suicide. The theory was dark, unfounded, and deeply unfair to Rebecca's memory, but it circulated nonetheless, particularly in comment sections and anonymous forums where people felt free to speculate without evidence. The conspiracy theories, while frustrating to serious investigators, reflected a deeper truth. People needed to make sense of Rebecca's death. The official suicide ruling felt incomplete, unsatisfying. If it wasn't suicide, then what? The theories, however wild, were attempts to construct narratives that felt more complete than the ambiguous truth. Beyond the investigation, beyond the legal battles, beyond the media coverage and conspiracy theories, there remained a human being whose life was cut short. Rebecca Zaha was more than a case file, more than a true crime story, more than a mystery to be debated on the internet. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman who had overcome tremendous obstacles to build a life in America. She had escaped poverty and persecution, adapted to a new culture, worked hard, pursued her dreams. Those who knew her remembered her kindness, her gentle manner, her quiet strength. They remembered her devotion to her family, her commitment to her faith, her willingness to help others. Her death, regardless of how it occurred, was a tragedy. A life full of promise ended at 30. The Zahau family established a foundation in Rebecca's memory, focused on helping other immigrants from Burma, providing resources for education, supporting the Chin community in America. Mary Zahau Lohner became an advocate not just for her sister's case, but for victims' rights more broadly, speaking about the challenges immigrant families face when seeking justice in the American legal system. She pointed out that if Rebecca had been wealthy, if she had been white, if she had been married to Jonah rather than just his girlfriend, the investigation might have been more thorough, the questions more aggressively pursued. This raised uncomfortable questions about bias, not necessarily conscious racism or classism, but the subtle ways that victims from marginalized communities sometimes receive less vigorous advocacy from the systems meant to protect them. Rebecca's church held memorial services for her, celebrating her life, praying for her soul, remembering her as a faithful Christian who had lived according to her values. Friends created online memorials, sharing photographs and memories, keeping her spirit alive in the digital space even as her body was laid to rest. Rebecca was buried in Missouri near Mary's home, in a cemetery where her family could visit. Her gravestone bore her name, her dates, and a simple inscription about her faith and the love she had shared with those around her. Visitors to the grave sometimes left flowers, notes, expressions of sympathy. Some were from people who had known Rebecca personally. Others were from strangers who had learned her story and felt compelled to pay respects to a woman whose death had touched them. More than a decade after Rebecca Zahau's death, the case remains as polarizing and unresolved as ever. The passage of time has not brought clarity. If anything, it has deepened the divisions between those who believe different versions of what happened that night. There are questions that may never be answered, mysteries that may never be solved, truths that may have died with Rebecca on that balcony in Coronado. The first and most fundamental question: did Rebecca Zahau take her own life, or was she murdered? After years of investigation, expert testimony, legal proceedings, and public debate, we still cannot answer this question with absolute certainty. The evidence supports both conclusions depending on how one interprets it, which experts one believes, which assumptions one makes about human behavior and probability. If Rebecca committed suicide, we must accept that she did so in a manner virtually unprecedented in the forensic literature, binding herself hand and foot, painting a cryptic message, hanging herself from a balcony while leaving no clear suicide note and displaying no warning signs to those who knew her. We must accept that a devout Christian from a culture where suicide is considered the gravest sin chose to end her life in degrading circumstances, naked and bound, in a house belonging to her boyfriend while his son lay dying in a hospital. We must accept that Rebecca's anguish over Max's accident, an accident for which she bore no legal or moral blame, according to all official determinations, was so overwhelming that it drove her to this extreme act within just 48 hours. It's possible. Human psychology is complex. People in crisis sometimes act in ways that defy prediction. Suicide can strike without warning. Cultural and religious prohibitions can be overcome by overwhelming despair. But it requires believing in a confluence of unlikely circumstances, a perfect storm of grief, guilt, and psychological break that left no trace in Rebecca's communications, her behavior, or the observations of those around her. If Rebecca was murdered, we must accept an equally troubling set of propositions. We must believe that someone, most likely Adam Shacknai, given his presence on the property, attacked and killed Rebecca, then staged an elaborate suicide scene complete with intricate bindings and a cryptic painted message. We must believe this person was able to overpower Rebecca without creating significant signs of struggle, bind her with expert precision, and hang her from the balcony in a way that fooled the initial investigators into concluding suicide. We must believe this person then calmly went about staging the scene, planting evidence, cleaning up, and ultimately, discovering the body in the morning while maintaining an appearance of shock and grief. We must believe this person has maintained their innocence for over a decade. Through investigations, interrogations, a civil trial, and relentless media scrutiny, never once breaking, never making a mistake that would definitively prove their guilt. This too is possible. Murderers have staged suicide scenes before. Killers have maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Forensic staging can be sophisticated enough to deceive investigators, but it requires believing in a level of coldness, calculation, and sustained deception that seems almost sociopathic. The truth is likely somewhere in these possibilities, but we may never know which one it is. Adam Shackney's life was irrevocably changed on the morning of July 13, 2011, when he discovered Rebecca's body. Whether he was an innocent man thrust into a nightmare or a guilty man who created nightmare, his existence since that day has been marked by suspicion, accusation, and controversy. He has given several interviews over the years, always maintaining his innocence, always expressing frustration with what he describes as a rush to judgment based on circumstantial evidence and conjecture. In a 2018 interview with a local news station, Adam spoke about the psychological toll of being suspected of murder. "I didn't kill Rebecca," he said, his voice carrying the wariness of someone who's repeated this statement hundreds of times. "I barely knew her. I had no reason to hurt her. I found her body, I tried to help, and for that I've been accused of one of the worst crimes imaginable." He described the isolation, the loss of friendships, the way people looked at him differently after the civil verdict. Even though he was never criminally charged, the court of public opinion had convicted him. "People believe what they want to believe," Adam said. "They read articles, they watch TV shows, and they decide I'm guilty. They don't know me, they weren't there. But they're certain I'm a murderer." Adam's defense of himself has been consistent across all his public statements. He has never wavered from his account of finding Rebecca's body, cutting her down, calling 911. He has never contradicted himself on material facts. This consistency could be evidence of truthfulness. An innocent man's story doesn't change because it's the truth. Or it could be evidence of careful preparation. A guilty man's story doesn't change because he's rehearsed it thoroughly. There's no way to distinguish between these interpretations based on consistency alone. Adam has also expressed anger at what he sees as investigative failures and bias. "The police decided early on it was suicide," he said in another interview. "Then when people started questioning that, they needed someone to blame. I was convenient. I was there. So I became the suspect, even though there's no evidence I did anything wrong." He pointed to the DNA evidence, or rather, the lack of it. His DNA was found only on the portions of rope he had touched while cutting Rebecca down. His fingerprints were on the knife he used. But no DNA or fingerprints of his were found in the bedroom, on the ropes that bound Rebecca, on the paint tube used for the message. If I had tied those ropes, if I had painted that message, if I had been in that room doing what they accused me of, Adam argued. But there isn't. Because I wasn't there. This argument has merit. Modern forensic DNA analysis is incredibly sensitive. It can detect trace amounts of DNA from skin cells, sweat, saliva. If Adam had spent significant time in that bedroom binding Rebecca, painting messages, staging the scene, it would be almost impossible for him to leave no trace. Unless he wore gloves. Unless he was extraordinarily careful. Unless he cleaned up thoroughly. The absence of evidence, as investigators often note, is not evidence of absence. It's suggestive but not conclusive. Adam has also addressed the civil trial verdict, calling it a miscarriage of justice driven by emotion. "The jury felt bad for Rebecca's family," he said. "I understand that, it's a tragedy, but feeling bad doesn't make me guilty. They wanted someone to blame, to hold responsible. And I was the only option available. It wasn't about evidence. It was about giving the family someone to point to." Adam's attorneys echoed this sentiment, arguing that civil trials are inherently less reliable than criminal trials, that the lower burden of proof and the emotional nature of wrongful death cases can lead to verdicts that wouldn't survive criminal court scrutiny. Whether Adam is a victim of circumstance or a murderer who escaped justice depends entirely on which version of events one believes. And belief, in the absence of definitive proof, is a matter of interpretation, bias, and personal judgment. One of the most striking aspects of the Rebecca Zahaw case has been Jonah Shacknai's near total public silence. The man at the center of the tragedy, the boyfriend, the father of the dying child, the owner of the mansion where Rebecca died, has remained largely invisible in the public discourse surrounding the case. Jonah has given only a handful of interviews, and in those he has been carefully neutral, expressing grief over Rebecca's death and Max's death, but declining to take strong positions on the investigation's conclusions. In a brief statement released shortly after the civil verdict, Jonah said, "Rebecca's death was a tragedy that compounded the unbearable loss of my son. I have cooperated fully with all investigations and respect the legal processes that have unfolded. My focus remains on honoring Max's memory and moving forward with my life." The statement was measured, diplomatic, revealing nothing of Jonah's personal beliefs about how Rebecca died. Did Jonah believe Rebecca had committed suicide? Or did he harbor suspicions about his brother's involvement? We don't know, he hasn't said. This silence has led to speculation. Some believe Jonah knows more than he's revealed, that he's protecting Adam out of family loyalty. Others believe Jonah is simply a grieving man who wants privacy, who has suffered enough loss without becoming a public figure in a media circus. There have been reports, unconfirmed and based on anonymous sources, that Jonah and Adam had a falling out after the civil verdict, that the brothers' relationship was strained by the allegations and the legal consequences. Other reports suggested Jonah stood by Adam completely, even financially supporting his defense and appeal efforts. Without Jonah speaking publicly about these matters, the truth of his relationship with Adam and his beliefs about Rebecca's death remain unknown. Jonah sold the Spreckles mansion in 2013 for $91 million, significantly less than its assessed value. The reduced price was attributed to the property's dark history. Buyers were unwilling to pay full price for a house where two tragic deaths had occurred. Jonah also sold his pharmaceutical company, Medicis, in 2012 for $2.6 billion. He stepped away from the corporate world, reportedly focusing on private investments and philanthropy. In the years since Rebecca's and Max's deaths, Jonah has maintained an extremely low profile. He remarried, a private ceremony, no public announcements. He continues to live in Southern California but has avoided media attention. One person who knew Jonah socially in the years after the tragedies said he seemed haunted, a man carrying unimaginable grief who had aged visibly under the weight of loss. He never talked about it, the acquaintance said. You could see it in his eyes, the pain, but he kept it locked inside. Some people process grief publicly, some privately. Jonah was definitely the latter. What Jonah knows, what he believes, what he thinks about the various investigations and theories, these remain mysteries locked inside a man who values his privacy and has the wealth to maintain it. One frustrating aspect of the Rebecca Zahaw case is that it occurred in 2011. A time when forensic technology was advanced but not as sophisticated as it would become in subsequent years. DNA analysis capabilities have improved significantly since 2011. Touch DNA collection and analysis has become more sensitive. Digital forensics has evolved. Crime scene reconstruction tech have advanced. If Rebecca's death occurred today with current technology, would investigators be able to determine more definitively what happened? Possibly. Modern DNA analysis might be able to extract more information from the ropes, potentially identifying whether skin cells or sweat from Rebecca or Adam or anyone else were present in ways the 2011 analysis couldn't detect. Enhanced digital forensics might be able to recover deleted files from Rebecca's phone or computer, potentially revealing communications or searches that weren't found in the original investigation. Advanced crime scene reconstruction software could create three-dimensional models of the bedroom and balcony, allowing for more precise biomechanical analysis of the hanging scenario, but these technologies cannot be retroactively applied with full effectiveness. The evidence is what it is, collected in 2011 with 2011 methods. Some of the physical evidence has degraded over time or has been consumed in previous testing. The ropes, for instance, have been handled by numerous people, investigators, experts, attorneys examining them for trial. Each handling potentially adds contaminating DNA and degrades the original evidence. The bedroom has been remodeled by the new owners of the mansion. The exact positions of furniture, the precise measurements of everything in the room on the night Rebecca died. These have been documented in photographs and diagrams, but the physical scene itself no longer exists in its original state. This is the tragedy of all cold cases. Evidence degrades, memories fade, witnesses die, and the window for definitive answers slowly closes. The Zaha family has called for the evidence to be retested using modern methods, to give new experts the opportunity to examine everything with fresh eyes and better tools. The San Diego Sheriff's Department has resisted these calls, maintaining that the original investigation was thorough, and that retesting is unlikely to change the fundamental conclusions. There's a standoff between those who believe more could be learned, and those who believe the case is settled. And in that standoff, the truth remains locked away, perhaps forever. The Rebecca Zaha case has had ripple effects beyond itself, influencing how death investigations are conducted and how unusual circumstances are evaluated. Forensic experts who teach death investigation courses now use Rebecca's case as an example of the importance of thwarting all possibilities before concluding suicide. The case has become a cautionary tale about the dangers of premature closure, of accepting a suicide conclusion, simply because no clear evidence of homicide is immediately apparent. Some jurisdictions have revised their protocols for investigating deaths that involve unusual circumstances, extensive binding cryptic messages, scenarios that seem inconsistent with typical suicide presentations. The case has also sparked discussions about the role of family advocacy in investigations. Rebecca's family refused to accept the official ruling, hired their own experts, pursued civil litigation, and kept the case in the public eye. Without their efforts, the case would have been closed and forgotten. But because they persisted, millions of people know Rebecca's story, and questions continue to be asked. This has led to broader conversations about victims' rights, about how families can participate in investigations, about the power dynamics between wealthy suspects and immigrant victims, about whether the system works equally for everyone. Some advocate groups have used Rebecca's case as an example of why families should never simply accept official conclusions when they conflict with their knowledge of their loved one. Other experts warn that family advocacy, while understandable and often necessary, can also complicate investigations, leading to selective interpretation of evidence and refusal to accept uncomfortable truths. The balance between honoring families' knowledge of victims and maintaining investigative objectivity remains a challenge in death investigations. Rebecca's case sits at the heart of that challenge, an example of both the value of family advocacy and the complications it can create. The rise of true crime as entertainment has created a vast community of amateur sleuths, podcast listeners, and Reddit investigators who examine cases with varying degrees of expertise and responsibility. The Rebecca Zaha case has been extensively discussed in these communities, with thousands of people offering theories, analyzing evidence, and debating the various scenarios. Some of this discussion has been thoughtful and well-informed. Amateur investigators have occasionally identified details that professional investigators overlooked, found witnesses who hadn't been interviewed, or developed theories that deserve serious consideration. But much of the online discussion has been less helpful, based on incomplete information, influenced by bias and assumptions, sometimes veering into conspiracy theory territory. The anonymity of internet forums allows people to make accusations they would never make publicly, to speculate wildly without accountability, to treat real human tragedy as a puzzle or game. Rebecca's family has had mixed feelings about the true crime community's interest in the case. On one hand, the sustained attention has kept pressure on authorities and prevented the case from fading into obscurity. On the other hand, the endless speculation, the sometimes cruel theories, the treatment of Rebecca's death as entertainment rather than tragedy, all of this has been painful. Mary Zaha Loner addressed this in a 2020 interview. "I'm grateful that people care about Rebecca, that they want justice for her. But sometimes I see the things people write online, the theories they come up with, and I remember that they're talking about my sister, a real person who lived and died. She's not just a mystery to be solved. She was a human being with dreams and hopes and people who loved her." The true crime phenomenon has brought benefits, increased awareness, sometimes helpful insights, pressure for justice. But it has also brought costs, insensitivity, speculation, the commodification of tragedy. Rebecca's case exemplifies both the potential and the problems of amateur involvement in death investigations. Even after all these years, it's worth revisiting the physical evidence one more time, examining it with the knowledge we now have and the questions that remain unanswered. The orange rope around Rebecca's neck. Where exactly did it come from? The official investigation concluded it was from the mansion's storage area, but who specifically knew it was there? Who had access to it? If Rebecca obtained it for suicide, how did she know where to find it in a house that wasn't really hers? The red rope binding her wrists and ankles, same questions. Who knew these ropes were available? Who had the knowledge to tie the specific knots used? Rebecca had no background in sailing or rope work. Adam, as a tugboat captain, served the bed to which the orange rope was attached. It was extremely heavy, unmoved during the incident. This suggests the rope was tied to it while the bed was in its normal position. But threading a rope from a bed through the room, out onto the balcony, and over the railing while maintaining the precise positioning required for the hanging, this would be difficult for someone working alone. Easier for someone who could position everything before the victim was involved. The paint used for the message Rebecca's DA was on the tube, but the brush was wiped clean. Why wipe the brush if you're about to commit suicide? Or did someone else use the brush while wearing gloves, and Rebecca's DA was on the tube from previous innocent handling? The message itself, Seichi Seiji Dou Seiar, the capitalization, the lack of punctuation, the cryptic phrasing, does this sound like something Rebecca would write? Or does it sound like someone trying to create the appearance of a disturbed mental state? Rebecca's naked body. She was completely nude when found. Her nightgown was on the bed. The official theory is that she removed it herself before the suicide. But why? Nudity in suicide is extremely rare, especially for women, especially for someone from a conservative religious background. Nudity in homicide, however, particularly in cases involving sexual elements or humiliation, is more common. The lack of defensive wounds. Rebecca had no scratches, no bruises on her arms or hands beyond the ligature marks, no skin under her fingernails. If she was attacked, possible explanations: she was overpowered too quickly, she was rendered unconscious before she could resist, or there was no attack because it was suicide. The timeline: Rebecca's phone went silent between min and 3:00 a.m. Her body was discovered at 6:48 a.m. That's a window of approximately 6 hours during which she died. The medical examiner estimated time of death before discovery, consistent with the early morning hours. What was happening during those hours? Was Rebecca alone, contemplating suicide, building up the courage? Or was someone with someone who attacked her? Adam's account of cutting her down. He said he lifted her, then cut the rope. This was described as an instinctive attempt to save her. But cutting the rope destroyed evidence. The original knot configuration was lost, making it impossible to determine whether the knot was consistent with self-tying or being tied by another person. Was this innocent impulse or calculated evidence destruction? The 911 call. Adam's voice on the recording has been analyzed by experts. Some say he sounds appropriately distressed. Others say he sounds too calm, too controlled for someone who just found a hanging body. Voice stress analysis is notoriously unreliable, but the debate continues. Each piece of evidence, examined in isolation, can be explained by either suicide or homicide. It's only when you try to assemble all the pieces into a coherent narrative that the problems emerge. The suicide narrative requires accepting multiple unusual elements: the elaborate binding, the cryptic message, the nudity, the lack of warning signs, all occurring simultaneously in a case involving a victim with no history of mental illness or suicidal ideation. The homicide narrative requires accepting a sophisticated staging by someone with no apparent motive, no forensic evidence linking them definitively to the crime, and the psychological capacity to maintain innocence under years of scrutiny. Neither narrative feels completely satisfying, and that's the fundamental problem with this case. One aspect of Rebecca's case that deserves deeper examination is how her identity as an immigrant woman from Burma may have influenced both her life and the investigation into her death. Rebecca came from the Chin ethnic minority, a people who have faced systematic persecution in Myanmar for generations. The Chin are predominantly Christian and a Buddhist majority nation, and this religious difference has made them targets of discrimination, violence, and economic marginalization. For Rebecca to have escaped Burma, to have immigrated to America, to have built a successful life here, this represented an extraordinary achievement, a triumph over circumstances that would have defeated many others. But even in America, Rebecca remained an outsider in many ways. She spoke English well, but with an accent. She looked different from the white, wealthy residents of Coronado. She worked as a medical technician while dating a billionaire, a Cinderella story that some viewed with admiration and others with suspicion. When Rebecca died, some observers noted troubling aspects of how she was treated by investigators and the media. In the initial news coverage, Rebecca was frequently identified by her ethnicity and immigrant status. Asian girlfriend, foreign-born. Identifiers that, while factually accurate, seemed to emphasize her otherness. Some articles focused on her relationship with Jonah in ways that carried subtle implications about gold digging, about foreign women targeting wealthy American men, about opportunism disguised as romance. These were often dog whistle narratives, never stated explicitly but present in the subtext, in the choice of which details to emphasize, in the framing of her relationship as somehow suspicious or transactional. Rebecca's family and advocates pointed out that if Rebecca had been a Wirakan woman from a wealthy family, the investigation might have proceeded differently. The suicide conclusion might have been questioned more aggressively. The possibility of foul play might have been taken more seriously from the outset. This is difficult to prove, of course. We can't rerun the investigation with Rebecca's ethnicity changed and see if the outcome differs. But the questions about bias, unconscious or otherwise, are legitimate and troubling. Dr. Michelle Moore, a sociologist who has studied how immigrant victims are treated in the American criminal justice system, reviewed the Rebecca Zahau case and noted several concerning patterns. Immigrant victims, especially women, often face a credibility gap. Dr. Moore explained in a 2019 academic paper. Their accounts are questioned more readily. Their behaviors are interpreted through stereotypes. And when they die under suspicious circumstances, there's sometimes a tendency to accept explanations that wouldn't be as quickly accepted for native-born white victims. Dr. Moore wasn't accusing investigators of deliberate racism, but rather pointing out systemic patterns that can influence how cases are handled even by well-intentioned professionals. The language barrier, even minor, can affect interviews and investigations. Cultural differences can be misunderstood, and the lack of powerful advocates. Rebecca's family was in Missouri and Burma, not locally present to immediately demand answers, can mean cases don't receive the immediate, aggressive scrutiny they might otherwise get. These observations don't prove the investigation was biased, but they raise important questions about equity in the justice system, about whether all victims receive equal treatment regardless of their background. Rebecca's case became, for some advocates, a symbol of these broader issues. Her story was used to highlight the challenges immigrant communities face when seeking justice, when navigating a legal system that may not fully understand their cultural context, when trying to make their voices heard in a society where they remain, in some ways, outsiders. The ripple effects of Rebecca's death extended far beyond the immediate investigation and legal proceedings. The trauma radiated outward, affecting everyone connected to the case in ways that continue to this day. For Rebecca's family, the loss was compounded by the uncertainty. Not knowing definitively what happened to their sister, their daughter, meant the wound could never fully heal. The questions never stopped. The grief never resolved into acceptance. Mary Zahau Loener has spoken about the psychological cost of fighting for justice for over a decade. The constant reliving of trauma, the media appearances, the legal battles, the endless analysis of how her sister died, all of it has taken a profound toll. "Some days I can't get out of bed," Mary admitted in a 2021 interview. The weight of it all, The knowledge that Rebecca's killer, if she was killed, might never face justice, it crushes me. But then I remember that if I give up, if I stop fighting, Rebecca's story gets forgotten. So I get up. I keep going for her. The Zahal family has struggled with secondary trauma as well. Rebecca's other siblings, her parents back in Burma, extended family members, all have been affected by the loss and the controversy surrounding it. In Chin culture, family bonds are extraordinarily strong. Rebecca's death wasn't just the loss of an individual. It was a wound to the entire family structure, a piece of their collective identity torn away. Some family members in Burma, with limited access to American media and legal proceedings, struggled to understand what had happened. They relied on Mary to explain, to translate both literally and culturally what was occurring in the investigation. The burden on Mary as the family's primary advocate and interpreter was immense. For Jonah Shacknai, the trauma was different found. Within 5 days in July 2011, he lost his 6-year-old son and his girlfriend. The circumstances of both deaths, Max's unexplained fall, Rebecca's controversial hanging, created a nightmare of loss compounded by mystery. People who knew Jonah described him as fundamentally changed by the tragedies. The successful businessman, the confident executive, became a withdrawn figure, avoiding public life, carrying visible scars of grief. Jonah's other children, his adult son and daughter from his first marriage, also suffered. They lost their younger Max and witnessed their father's devastation. The family that had once seemed blessed by wealth and success was shattered. Dina Romano, Max's mother, faced perhaps the most concentrated horror of all. Her 6-year-old son fell under mysterious circumstances while in someone else's care. She spent 3 days at his hospital watching him die. And during those same days, the woman who had been caring for Max when he fell died under equally mysterious circumstances. The grief of losing a child is described by those who experienced it as the worst pain imaginable. For Dina, that grief was complicated by questions about Max's fall, by the controversy surrounding Rebecca's death, by media attention and speculation. Dina has remained almost entirely out of the public eye since Max's death. The few statements she's released have focused on honoring Max's memory and requesting privacy. The psychological cost she's paid remains private, known only to her and those closest to her. For Adam Shacknai, whether innocent or guilty, the years since finding Rebecca's body have been marked by suspicion, accusation, and social ostracism. Being labeled a murderer, even if only in civil court, even if never criminally charged, carries profound consequences. Adam has described losing friendships, facing hostility in public, living under a cloud of suspicion that colors every interaction. If he is innocent, this represents a gross injustice, an innocent man destroyed by circumstance. If he is guilty, it represents inadequate punishment, a murderer who escaped criminal justice. Either way, the psychological toll is real. The first responders who arrived that morning in July 2011 were also affected. Paramedics and police officers who witnessed Rebecca's body, who tried to process the bizarre scene, who worked the investigation. Many have said the case stayed with them in ways other cases didn't. One former investigator, speaking anonymously years later, said, "You see a lot of death in this job, you develop coping mechanisms. But some cases get under your skin. The Zahal case was one of those for me. The unanswered questions, the feeling that maybe we missed something, it haunts you. Trauma doesn't respect boundaries. It spreads, infects, persists. And in cases like Rebecca's, where closure remains elusive, the trauma continues indefinitely." The extensive media coverage of Rebecca's case raises important questions about the ethics of true crime journalism and entertainment. On one hand, media attention has kept the case alive, prevented it from being forgotten, maintained pressure for answers. Without television coverage, podcast episodes, and news articles, Rebecca's death would have faded from public consciousness long ago. On the other hand, the media has sometimes treated the case as entertainment rather than tragedy, focused on sensational details rather than substantive questions, and given platform to wild speculation that has caused additional pain to those involved. Television shows featuring the case often use dramatic reenactments, actors portraying Rebecca's final moments, depicting her binding herself or being attacked, showing her hanging from the balcony. These recreations, while labeled as reenactments, can feel exploitative, turning someone's death into a visual spectacle. Podcasts sometimes engage in extended speculation about scenarios for which there is no evidence, essentially creating fiction around real people and real tragedy. Social media discussions can devolve into callous judgment, people casually declaring Adam guilty or Rebecca suicidal based on superficial analysis, treating the case as a puzzle rather than acknowledging the human cost. Some media outlets have been more responsible than others. Certain journalists have focused on substantive issues, investigative failures, forensic questions, systemic problems revealed by the case, rather than simply rehashing the sensational details. But the true crime genre as a whole struggles with the tension between public interest and private tragedy, between informing audiences and exploiting victims, between legitimate journalism and voyeuristic entertainment. Rebecca's family has had to navigate this landscape, trying to use media attention to advance their search for justice, while also protecting Rebecca's dignity and their own privacy. It's an impossible balance, and the ethical questions remain unresolved. After examining every aspect of this case, after considering all the evidence and theories and expert opinions, what can we conclude? The truth is that certainty eludes us. The evidence for suicide includes the medical examiner's ruling, the lack of DNA from another person in incriminating locations, the absence of clear motive for anyone to kill Rebecca, the demonstrations showing self-binding is technically possible, and the statistical reality that unusual suicides, while rare, do occur. The evidence against suicide includes the biomechanical improbability of the scenario, the unprecedented nature of the method, the lack of suicide ideation in Rebecca's history or recent behavior, the expert opinions suggesting the bindings were applied by another person, and the civil jury verdict finding Adam liable for her death. The evidence for homicide includes Adam's presence on the property, his access and opportunity, the suspicious timing, the cryptic message that could be staging, the scalp hemorrhages that could indicate struggle, and the financial judgment against him in civil court. The evidence against homicide includes the lack of forensic evidence definitively linking Adam to the crime, the absence of clear motive, Adam's consistent account and cooperation with investigators, and the official classification of the death as suicide by multiple agencies. If you weigh the evidence looking for reasons to believe suicide, you can build a case. If you weigh the evidence looking for reasons to believe homicide, you can build that case too. The evidence is genuinely ambiguous, genuinely susceptible to multiple interpretations. What we're left with is probability and judgment. Is it more likely that Rebecca, a woman with no history of mental illness or suicidal ideation, bound herself hand and foot and hanged herself in a bizarre and unprecedented manner within 48 hours of a traumatic event? Or is it more likely that someone on the property that night killed her and staged an elaborate suicide scene? Different people, applying their own judgment and experience, will answer differently. And that's the tragedy of the Rebecca Zahau case. Not just that she died, but that we may never know with certainty how she died. As of 14 years after Rebecca's death, the case remains officially closed. The San Diego Sheriff's Department maintains its suicide ruling. No criminal charges have ever been filed. The investigation is not active. The civil judgment against Adam Shacknai stands. He has been found liable for Rebecca's death in civil court, ordered to pay millions to her family. Collection efforts have continued, with varying degrees of success. Adam continues to maintain his innocence and has given occasional interviews reiterating his account of events. Rebecca's family continues to seek justice, though the intensity of their public advocacy has diminished somewhat as the years have passed and legal options have been exhausted. Mary Zahau, Lowenner, still speaks about the case when media outlets reach out, still insists Rebecca was murdered, still hopes for some new development that might finally bring definitive answers. Jonah Shacknai remains silent, living his life away from public scrutiny. The Spreckles mansion has changed hands again, and is now owned by people with no connection to the events of 2011. The new owners have renovated extensively, trying to move past the property's dark history. Occasional news articles mark anniversaries of Rebecca's death, recycling the same details, the same questions, the same lack of answers. The case appears periodically in true crime media, a new podcast episode, a documentary update, a YouTube deep dive. Each retelling covers the same ground, reaches the same inconclusive end. Max Shacknai, the little boy whose accident preceded all of this tragedy, is remembered by those who loved him but has largely faded from public discussion. His death, ruled accidental, is treated as a separate tragedy, even though it's inextricably linked to Rebecca's story. There have been no significant new developments in recent years. No new witnesses. No new forensic revelations. No confessions. No smoking guns. The case has settled into a kind of permanent limbo, not forgotten, but not resolved. Not closed in people's minds even though it's closed in official records. For those seeking tidy endings, seeking clear answers, seeking justice that feels satisfying and complete, the Rebecca Zaha case offers none of these things. It offers only questions, ambiguity, and the uncomfortable reminder that some mysteries may never be solved. Beyond the specific details of Rebecca's death, beyond the arguments about suicide versus homicide, beyond the legal battles and media coverage, what does this case teach us? It teaches us about the limits of forensic science. We like to believe that modern investigative techniques can solve any crime, can answer any question about how someone died. But the truth is more complicated. Evidence can be ambiguous. Experts can disagree. Technology has limits. It teaches us about the importance of thoroughness in death investigations. Whether or not the original investigation was flawed, the controversy surrounding the case highlights how critical it is to investigate all possibilities before reaching conclusions, to document everything meticulously, to consider alternative scenarios even when one seems obvious. It teaches us about the role of family advocacy. Rebecca's family refused to accept the official ruling and fought for years to challenge it. Their advocacy kept the case alive and led to new examinations of the evidence. But it also raises questions about when family beliefs should influence official investigations and when they should not. It teaches us about bias and equity in the justice system. The questions about whether Rebecca's immigrant status affected how her death was investigated are important, uncomfortable questions that deserve serious consideration. It teaches us about the psychology of belief. People examining the same evidence reach different conclusions based on their priors, their experiences, their biases. We believe what fits our existing framework for understanding the world, and we resist evidence that challenges that framework. It teaches us about the human cost of unresolved tragedy. The families, the friends, the people connected to Rebecca's death, all continue to carry the weight of unanswered questions, of grief without closure, of loss without resolution. It teaches us that truth is sometimes elusive. We want clear answers. We want to know what happened. But reality doesn't always cooperate with our desire for certainty. And perhaps most importantly, it teaches us about the value of a human life. Rebecca Zaha was not just a case file, not just a mystery, not just a story to be consumed as entertainment. She was a person, a daughter, a sister, a friend, a woman with dreams and hopes and a life that mattered. Whether she took that life herself or had it taken from her, the loss is real and profound. The mansion on Ocean Boulevard in Coronado still stands, its white walls and red tiled roof catching the California sun. The balcony where Rebecca's body hung has been modified, changed, made different from what it was that morning in July 2011. The palm trees still sway in the coastal breeze. The ocean still whispers against the shore. Life continues in Coronado, in San Diego, in the world that moved on from Rebecca's death, even as some people, her family, those who loved her, those who seek justice for her, never could. Rebecca Maui Zaha is buried in Missouri, far from the mansion where she died, far from the life she had built in California. Her grave is tended by family who still grieve, who still remember, who still seek answers that may never come. Was she a victim of her own despair, driven to self-destruction by guilt over a child's accident? Or was she the victim of violence, killed by someone who then staged an elaborate suicide to cover their crime? We may never know. What we do know is that on July 13, 2011, a woman's life ended. A woman who had overcome poverty and persecution, who had built a new life in a new country, who had people who loved her and dreams for the future. That life mattered. Rebecca mattered. And regardless of how she died, she deserved better than the uncertainty, controversy, and unanswered questions that have become her legacy. Her story reminds us that evil can hide in plain sight, that tragedy can strike without warning, that truth can be obscured by ambiguity and time. It reminds us that some mysteries endure, that some questions remain unanswered, that justice doesn't always arrive even when we seek it desperately. And it reminds us that behind every true crime story, behind every mysterious death, behind every investigation and theory and debate, there is a human being whose life was cut short, whose story matters, whose memory deserves respect. Thank you for listening to Rebecca's story. Thank you for taking the time to understand not just the mystery of her death, but the reality of her life. If you found this case compelling, if Rebecca's story moved you, please leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Tell me where you're listening from, what this case means to you, whether you believe suicide or homicide, or whether, like so many others, you simply don't know. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps me continue telling these stories, honoring these victims, seeking truth even when it's elusive. Good night, everyone.